Thanks very much, John. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being here. And thanks to Ofgem and David McCrone, who will be presenting for us and answering questions, and for his team for being so enthusiastic and responsive. We've got a lot of community energy groups here. We've got Community Energy London, Wales and Scotland, 2 DNOs, NGO partners including Regen and Centre for Sustainable Energy, and various other consultants and interested folk. Briefly, please mute if you're not actually speaking. And we really want to keep the focus of the event on practicalities, how community energy can engage and influence Ofgem and work better together to help Ofgem regulate the energy transformation for community energy and zero carbon. At the end of the event, to inform future work, we'd like you to answer this big question. So please think about it during the event. It is, following this event, what are the ongoing obstacles from regulation to community energy projects, to growing the sector and transforming the energy system? And what could Ofgem, Community Energy England and others, and members do separately or together to improve the situation? And lastly, how could Ofgem regulate the energy system transformation to enable community energy and maximize social benefit? We'd love to hear what you have to say on that at the end of the event in the chat. The timetable, David will speak for 30 minutes on regulations with a community energy that community energy should be aware of, including the significant code review on access and targeted charges and RIIO-2 ED2. Then we will have clarification questions. Please store them up if there's anything you don't understand, and also an opportunity to raise any issues or questions to discuss later. After 10 minutes of that, or less if not needed, we'll move on to a discussion. We'd like to hear from any members who've experienced regulation challenges with their projects, and then to discuss what could be done to remove the obstacles and enable community energy. So please, if you've experienced that, be prepared to share. You can be sharing that in the chat from now on. Then from after that discussion, from about 5 past 3, we'll have a period of question and answer and discussions of any issues raised in the chat. Again, prioritizing those that are of practical current relevance rather than sort of academical interest. And then a wrap up with a couple of quick polls and a reminder to answer our big question in the chat, and finishing at 3:30. So now, without further ado, I'd like to encourage you to focus on David's presentation. It's a complex world. So we'd like to keep the chat box fairly quiet, other than logging those issues or your willingness to share your challenges, so that we can concentrate on the presentation, jot any questions to the end. David will answer the questions as best he can, but please understand he cannot be an expert on all of Ofgem's activity, and his specialism is charging and access. So now over to David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And I think John is driving the slides on my behalf. There we go. Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can see that. So good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to Duncan and Community Energy England for the introduction and inviting me to speak today. As Duncan said, I work within the Charging and Access team at Ofgem, and one of the major projects that we've been involved with over the last few years is called the Access and Forward-Looking Charges Significant Code Review, or Access SCR, is a bit more easier to say. And this is part of a wider range of reforms that are happening across Ofgem, BEIS and industry. And while I'll largely be talking about the Access SCR today, I will touch on the wider Future Charging and Access programme that we're involved with, the second real price control starting in 2023, and what these might mean for local and community energy projects in the future. And as Duncan said, we're also keen to hear experiences that you've had with the current regulatory arrangements, where there may be issues, where there are potential barriers, and how we might overcome those in the future. I'll also explain how you can engage with the Access SCR and make sure that your voices are heard as we move forward. And as Duncan explained, we have an opportunity for a Q&A that I'll do my best to answer the questions that come through, but where I need to take those questions away, happy to do so, happy to maybe make those links with other departments and divisions within Ofgem if that is more relevant, depending on the subjects that come through. So, John, if you could move on to the next slide, thanks. So this really just is an introduction to, and I think the key message I would take from this is one that I'm sure everyone's aware of, and that's that the energy system is going through a period of significant change. We're seeing central and devolved governments putting in place legislation to deliver targets for net zero. We're seeing increasing renewable generation coming onto the system. And we're also seeing changes in the way that customers use energy networks and the energy system, with increasing demand from low carbon technologies as we electrify transport and re-electrify heat. Oh, I think maybe if you could go back a slide, John, sorry, I think we've gone a bit forward. Sorry. So as I say, we're seeing changes in the energy system, and network companies are responding to this. Users of the energy system are responding to this, but also as a regulator, we're having to respond to this. And we have a role to make sure that, amongst other things, the access and charging arrangements that are in place that govern the system remain fit for purpose, that they encourage efficient use of networks, and that ultimately they protect consumers. And that's where our reforms come into play. And we have a number of projects running at the moment through retail and wholesale market reforms, the price controls, reforms to how the system operator, National Grid is the overall electricity system operator, operate, but also what we call future charging and access. So how users gain access to the system and how they are charged for that and for use of the system. If you could move on to the next slide, John, thanks. So the set of reforms of the programme that I'm mainly talk about today is what we call the Future Charging and Access programme. And this programme of work is looking at how we need to reform electricity network access and electricity network charging to meet the challenges that were described in the previous slide that are being faced by electricity networks in coming years, as well as helping to realise some of the opportunities that that provides. And it's split into three, largely speaking, three areas. There's access and forward-looking charging reform, or the Access SCR, and that's looking at how we can get most value from our electricity networks in the future and use them in a way that's most efficient and flexible. The second area of work is something called the Targeted Charging Review, or TCR. And this is another reform that is currently being implemented by industry following our decision last year. And in this set of changes, we're removing some of the distortions that existed that were potentially costing consumers money and allocating what we call the residual charge. So that part of the charge that users face for using the network that doesn't send a signal, but looking to see how that can be allocated in a fairer way. And lastly, our third reforms, working in combination with industry, is on balancing services or balancing reform. And that's looking at how users are charged by the system operator for the actions that are needed to balance supply and demand on the system. And just before Christmas, we published a letter setting out our response to recommendations from industry and how to take that forward. If you move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So what the main set of reforms that I'll talk about in the next few slides is the Access SCR. And the objective of the Access SCR is to ensure that electricity networks can be used efficiently and flexibly in the future, that they reflect what users need and want from the energy system, and that the arrangements that we put in place allow customers to benefit from new technologies, new services, new business models, while at the same time seeking to keep unnecessary costs or unnecessary increases in energy bills down. And there are two parts to the Access SCR. The first section, or the first thread to the work, is around what we call access arrangements. And here we're looking at the nature of users' access to electricity networks. How and when users can access the network, whether that is an unrestricted access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or perhaps it's limited in some way. Perhaps a user only needs access to the network at certain times of day, or at certain days of the week or seasons, whether or not it's more appropriate to have a different set of access arrangements in place, and also how those rights are allocated to users or between users. The second aspect is what we call forward-looking charges. And these are the charges which can provide signals to users about how their actions can increase or decrease network costs. For example, the upfront connection charge that a user would face for connecting to a distribution network can be higher if that user wants to connect in an area with little or no capacity, where the local network operator needs to invest to provide more capacity in the network. So the connection charge can provide a signal to users to locate in areas where perhaps it minimizes unnecessary investment. We're also looking at the ongoing charges that users face, so the use of system charges. And are there ways in which we can charge those or provide a signal through those charges so users minimize the cost that they place on the system? For example, they avoid using the network during periods of peak, or incentivized to avoid using the networks in periods of peak. If you move on, John. Thanks. So the approach we've taken to our work over the last, I think just over the last 2 years, has been to work with industry to develop, at first, a long list of options for reform. And last year, in February of last year, we published a short list of options. We've taken those forward over the last 12 months, further engaging with industry, further gathering evidence where we think the current arrangements perhaps don't work in users' interests, and also working with consultants, CPA, NEI, who are undertaking modelling work for us to assess the potential quantitative impacts and potential benefits of our shortlisted options, and to supplement our own qualitative assessment. We were due to publish our draft proposals shortly before Christmas last year, but we've taken the decision to pause temporarily, and we're working closely with colleagues in Ofgem who are looking at what we call full chain flexibility, looking at the emergence of flexibility services and the opportunities for network companies to procure flexibility in the future, and how do our Access SCR reforms complement and work with those reforms. So we're allowing that work to go forward, and we'll look to provide further details on timings for access and our proposals shortly after we publish our final forward work plan, which should be in March of this year. And just one other thing to talk about our approach is that we've also set out 3 guiding principles that are helping to inform our assessment to date, and will continue to do so. And that's, first of all, that we think any new arrangements that come into place should support efficient system development, So that includes the emergence of new business models, that includes facilitating net zero, at least cost to consumers. But the charging and access arrangements that we put in place for the future should help that overall efficiency and seek to keep unnecessary costs down as much as possible. The second principle that we're seeking to follow is that any new arrangements should reflect that energy is an essential service for users. And thirdly, that any changes that we make should be practical, should be proportionate, that users should be able to understand the new arrangements and that they should be implemented, or be able to be implemented in a relatively straightforward way. Next slide, please. So just going on to a bit more detail about the sorts of options that we are considering and some of the changes that may be made to the charging and access arrangements in the future. So firstly, we're looking at making reforms to the ongoing use of system charges that users face for the use of the distribution network. Currently, users will face a Dnos charge that is the same wherever they are in a Dnos given region. So the costs are averaged across that region. We're looking at whether or not we can better reflect how costs vary in different locations. So moving from, at certain voltage levels, moving from an averaged charge or average costs to more granular approach. We're also looking at what is driving those costs that are then reflected in use of system tariffs. The current assumption is that areas are often demand dominated, and it's demand in the network that's driving costs. But we think there could be areas where generation is driving those costs. So there may be arguments for seeking to put more charges on generation, and maybe credits for demand where they offset those constraints. And we're looking at where we can make reforms in that space. On connection charging, stakeholders have told us that the current arrangements where there is a need to contribute to wider network reinforcement that might be needed to facilitate a connection can be acting as a barrier to new projects and new connections going ahead. We also think that moving to a set of arrangements where Dnos are required to fund more of those costs might unlock opportunities for more efficient system development. So rather than an incremental approach to development, could it encourage network companies to look at the needs across maybe the whole system or the wider network and lead to efficiencies there. So we may move to a set of arrangements where more or potentially all reinforcement is funded through the ongoing distribution charge rather than an upfront initial charge levied on the connectee. We're also looking at improved choice and definition of access rights. So perhaps improving the choice of time profiled or non-firm access rights, so that perhaps better meets users' needs, but also provides more clarity and certainty around where users might be curtailed in the future and allowing them to manage that risk. And lastly, we are also looking at transmission charging and whether or not we need to make changes to those arrangements to remove potential distortions between different generators, large and small generators. Okay, if we can move on, John. Thanks. So what might this actually mean in practice, or in this alliterative example that we have here? In this example, we have a community energy or a local energy project seeking to connect demand and generation to the network. However, they're seeking to do so in an area where the upstream network the upstream high voltage network is constrained by existing generation connections. How could our Access SCR reforms potentially facilitate connections like this or remove some of the barriers that they might be facing? So under our connection charging reforms, we could move to a situation where the project pays less or potentially makes no contribution in their upfront charge to any network reinforcement that's required. And we think that would significantly reduce the cost of the connection and potentially influence investment decisions about whether or not to progress with a project that perhaps under the current arrangements would not have gone ahead. In terms of access rights, by giving better definition and clarity around when constraints may occur and when that generator may be interrupted, it's easier for that user to manage that risk and factor that again into their decision making. Duress charges, by moving to a more locational set of distribution charges, we could improve cost reflectivity. The charges would better reflect the costs that they are placing on the system in that local area. And if the energy project is either balancing generation demand locally, or perhaps its demand is offsetting some of those generation constraints, they could either receive lower charges in that case, or even perhaps receive a credit for the deferred investment or deferring the investment that is happening. And lastly, on transmission charging, we said we think removing distortions or reducing distortions that might exist today between large and small generators could influence investment decisions, potentially help facilitate competition in generation going forward. If we move on. So we just have one slide here. I just wanted to touch on the other sort of key development for people to be aware of that's ongoing is the development of the next electricity distribution price control, or real ED2. We published our decision on the approach we are going to take for this, or our sector-specific methodology, just before Christmas, setting out how we intend that to support net zero, how we intend to explore the use of flexibility in smart technologies ahead of traditional network investment. And we're also looking to develop new arrangements and incentives to improve the service that customers seeking to connect and to use distribution networks can expect. Dnos will be working on their draft business plans now, ahead of submission in the summer, with final business plans due in December 2021 this year. We'll then look to publish our draft determinations next summer, with final determinations at the end of next year, with the next price control period starting from April 2023. If we move on, thanks. Yep. And just finally, how you can engage with the Access SCR and get in touch with us if you have more questions or perhaps evidence that would help support our policy development. We're very keen to understand the issues that users are facing with the current arrangements, where perhaps current arrangements have acted as a blocker to some, or have hindered projects that perhaps have either not gone ahead or gone ahead under slightly different proposals, and how our potential changes could possibly benefit, or where people think there are risks, and maybe perhaps transitional arrangements may be needed. We'd be keen to hear views on all those questions. You can get in touch with us directly at the FutureChargingandAccess email address that's there. And also online at www.futurechargingandAccess.org. www.chargingfutures.com. You'll find a wealth of material on all the projects that I've talked about, Access SCR, the TCR, and balancing reform, along with various presentations that we've given in the past to our challenge and delivery groups and Charging Futures forum, as well as being able to sign up for future updates and future events that you'll be able to join and keep informed as the project develops. Okay. I think that's the last slide from myself. So maybe I'll hand back to Duncan at this stage.
Thanks. Oh. Thanks very much, David. That was to a fairly rank amateur like myself. That was very illuminating. Thank you. And it's really great to hear you committing and so keen to work with community energy
Sure.
to make it work for both of us.
Duncan, I just need to interject. I don't think people are going to be able to hear you very well at the moment. Might be a mic issue.
No, you're on silent there, Duncan.
Is that better?
It is now. Thank you.
I beg your pardon. I was on a headphones, hoping that would be excluding some rather intrusive exterior noise. Okay, good. So we'll start with clarification questions of anything you didn't understand or would like a wider explanation of from the presentation. And I think this you can either put it in the chat, or if you want to speak, then you can click on reactions at the bottom and put your hand up, and we'll call upon you to utter. I know that we've already got one question from Rob Proctor of Community Energy Wales about the reforms mentioned on slide 7 and whether they're specifically related to energy or whether it's related to all energy projects.
Yes, so the Access SCR and those other reforms that I talked about will apply across the energy system. So yeah, community energy and all other users that are seeking to connect to the electricity distribution networks, whether that's a household domestic customer through to a large single generator or large demand user.
Great. There's a Daffy from Wales, Daff Watts says, would the same outcomes apply if a larger community energy project was connected at high voltage?
Well, I think it will vary, I guess, from case to case and what the sort of constraints on that particular situation might be. I think you'd have to look at things on a case-by-case basis, but the reforms that we're looking at will apply at low voltage, high voltage, and extra high voltage. So where we think there are benefits in making changes, they would flow through to projects connecting at any one of those points in the network.
Thank you. Paul says, we've no way of evaluating the likely impact on specific community energy projects. What about projects already in flight? By which I presume he means looking that they're not going to be viable. Some sort of transitional phasing in arrangements could therefore be important to avoid unintended adverse consequences for carbon abatement. In other words, projects not happening that would have made a real difference.
Yeah, I think the idea of transitional arrangements and implementation is one that we are taking into account and we'll be considering. I think probably more so on the distribution charging reform, the Dnos charging reform. There is maybe more of an argument there for transitional arrangements, whereas I think less so on connection charging. But that in itself brings few questions whether or not people view future arrangements as more palatable or more attractive, and maybe hold off on projects until that point. Yeah, I think if people do have, if there are views on sort of the impacts or the benefits of going into sort of transitional arrangements, or what some of these reforms may mean for projects that are being considered right now, if people would maybe pause projects or accelerate projects, perhaps, that'd be useful to know.
So contact you with information around that.
Yeah.
There's a question about the forward-looking charges, the dynamic tariffs in the future. Obviously important in making a market and influencing behavior and the shape of what is installed where. But we've only got, at the moment, one available household or community level tariff. I think that's the co-op tariff. No, the Octopus tariff. And there is significant equity issues if they become a norm. That's a comment from Richard at York Community Energy. Yeah,
I think what I'd say there is just what we're talking about here is the distribution use of system tariffs, so the tariffs from the DNO to the distribution network operator through to the supplier, or in some cases direct to the user. How those are then reflected by suppliers, further down the chain, is a very valid question. I think that's something that we have asked in the past, and will be taken into account how well those, or how well more granular network tariffs can be reflected in end supplier retail tariffs. So you get that response from the user. I think is an important part.
Yeah. Sydney Charles from Community Energy London has a sort of question based also on flexible charging. Business and community installations have often installed renewable energy in order to not pay high time of use during peak periods when their panels are reducing their demand. Would they be penalised? I suppose that's a question about embedded benefits.
I think what we're trying with the distribution charging reform is better reflect the costs, sending improved signals to users about when they're taking actions that increase or decrease costs on the network. So I would imagine if a demand user was seeking to import from the electricity network at the time when off peak, yes, they are adding to costs. There is an argument, I think, there that they should contribute to that. Similarly with a generator, if they're exporting and increasing costs, there may well be an argument there to contribute to that. And similarly, when one's offsetting the other, say when the generator is offsetting a demand, they may receive a credit. So I think it comes down to when users are operating their system and how their actions increase or decrease costs on the network, and how we can reflect that in charging.
Sorry, I'm just looking through the chats to see what's a logical next question. So Kirsty Shannon from Buckingham asks, what are the implications for energy prices to consumers on which community energy return on investment is predicated? For example, if we charge the site user 10p per kilowatt hour, that's a saving on current prices. But if the grid price falls below that, it extends payback times for projects, because they obviously are charging below retail price. This would be schools or community hall level projects, not solar farm?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm in a good position to talk about the retail tariffs or the supplier tariffs that might be facing. Maybe that's what I would have to take away. I think, like my sort of earlier comment, there is a question about how the sort of reformed Dnos charges are reflected in supplier tariffs in the next stage of the sort of chain.
Right, it's a big challenge for us, and compounded, of course, by the drop in energy prices. Right, Paul Hallis again. Will the DNOs be obliged to publish more transparent information on local distribution network constraints? Most of us would have no clue on how they would impact potential projects in our local area.
Yeah, so certainly aware the DNOs already publish information, whether that's in form of heat maps or other data. I think if there is other data out there that people think would be helpful, certainly would be keen to hear that. I think as a general principle, we would say transparency and more information would be a positive outcome. So if there were specific bits of information that people think are not working or could be improved or would be good to be introduced, I think we'd be keen to hear.
Oh, right. We're pretty near the point where we were going to ask if anybody has specific challenges they have experienced with projects, and for them to share either verbally or very concisely in a way I can read out in the chat. So please, could people be prepared to do that? I'm going to ask one more question, and there is a question that we received earlier, which I'm going to try and find. Yes, here we are. It's from Andy Maybury at Community Energy Scotland. How can community energy projects' interests be recognised in developing flexibility arrangements, which is obviously in the interests of the system and decarbonisation? To date, no DNOs have offered any demand turn up or generation turn down opportunities on PICLO, despite them telling new potential community generators that connections are not available due to grid constraints, which could be alleviated by PICLO contracts. And such generators are experiencing curtailment while no attempt is made to form a more efficient solution.
So I think on that one, I think what I would sort of flag, maybe rather than being able to in a position to give an answer or to put words in DNO's mouths, I'd maybe point to some work that we've recently started with Ofgem and what we call full chain flexibility. I think I mentioned that in the slides, and that's looking at how we can, as a whole, so I say we, not necessarily the Ofgem we, but looking at how we can use technology and new business models to support decarbonisation at least cost. And what I would sort of recommend or encourage people to do is to look at, if they haven't seen it already, to look at our forward work plan that's been published on our website and to engage on that, where we talk about the full chain flexibility programme and so the sorts of things and enablers that we'll be working on or propose to work on in the next 12 months to try and develop flexibility arrangements and to encourage more flexibility on the system. I will plug that forward work plan is still open for consultation till the 19th of February. And would encourage, if people have experience of flexibility arrangements or maybe experienced issues with the flexibility arrangements to date, to engage in that process and certainly influence and inform our work there.
Thank you. About informing work, somebody asks that the charging decisions have been postponed. Will they be known before the DNOs have to submit their business plans in April and then December?
No, that's a good question. We are still working on firming up our timelines for Access SCR. As I said, the draft business plans for the DNOs are due in the summer. I think it's well, we won't have published a final decision on the SCR by then. That's certainly the case. We are considering whether or not it's possible to make early draft decisions on aspects of the SCR before then. So we may make some early decisions or early draft decisions on the connection charging reforms or access rate reforms in time to inform certainly the final DNO business plans. But the rest of the SCR, the aspects on Dnos charging, for example, may come a little bit later than that. We are conscious of the next price control period starting in 2023, and the original plan certainly was for the SCR to be implemented alongside that. Certainly that may not be possible now, so we may be looking at a later implementation date for things as well.
Great. I can hear in everybody's questions the concern for being able to make a business case to do what we do at a local level, which has so many co-benefits. And somebody comments, predictability of income is key to the financial viability of community energy projects, which always have high upfront costs and don't have the access to venture capital that a commercial player will have. And is it envisaged that it will be possible to reinstate any long-term predictability of income, such as that which the FIT delivered, and which is envisaged in the CFD for onshore renewables? But of course, that only applies to larger than 5 megawatt projects, and so excludes most of ours. What's your prediction on that?
I think it would be dangerous of me to make a prediction. I think things like FITs and RHI and the other sort of environmental programs that government has developed over recent years, while that's something that Ofgem administers and runs on behalf of the government, I think that may well be a government decision as to whether or not they take forward or take something similar forward in the future. It's maybe certainly not within the remit of the access work or our charging and access reforms at this stage. So I'd maybe be, I'm not sure I can give a forecast on that, and would likely get it wrong if I tried.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think we should probably have a final question and then see if there's anybody out there who's prepared to confess their challenges, and we can look at real world actual problems. Is there anybody who is prepared to either cut and paste something into the chat, or to come on mic and tell a very short story? I see. Is anybody prepared to do that? If not, we'll carry on with this productive question and answer process. Is anybody sticking their hand up or posting in the chat? Sorry, I'm looking it up.
I might talk about a project that we have going on right now, Duncan, if that's agreeable.
Very agreeable. Thank you very much. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. David, thank you for a very interesting and a presentation. And also it's really encouraging to see that Ofgem is considering the issues of community energy development, which I think is the best way to protect the consumer. So we're aligned in our goals of ensuring clean, affordable energy for consumers. One of the projects that we're working on concerns the decarbonization of a rural village. So we're removing oil boilers and replacing them with heat pumps. And so the first problem that comes to mind immediately is connection to a low voltage network. And this particular low voltage network hasn't been invested by the DNO in about 60 years. So it really can't handle all of the connections of the heat pumps that we envision. That we've designed. And the problem is that the way the current regulatory environment works, we would be required as the developer, the community energy group, to fund part of that reinforcement cost. I have a fundamental ethical problem with paying the cost of the reinforcement of a low voltage network where the DNO has obviously been profiting from that for a number of years because of the lack of investment. What can we actually, and the problem is that if we have to pay, then we're going to have to pass that cost on to the customer in terms of the heat services agreement. So it almost makes our project unfeasible. Well, it's a threat. It's a serious threat to our project. This is going to be a problem that we see across the board around the country. What can we possibly do about this when we know that the DNO is actually going to be projected to be spent on the Rio 1 ED targets anyway? So there's clearly room in what's been legislated for the full investment in this low voltage network reinforcement.
Right, I think specifically on the access SCR proposals, that's a great example of some of the issues that we've been told do exist. That this contribution to reinforcement, or this requirement to contribute to reinforcement, is making connections prohibitively expensive for some users, and as a result, some projects are simply not going ahead. In the short term, I think it is difficult to see what can be done, because those are the charging arrangements, but we are looking at, actively looking at whether or not they should be reformed. So should that reinforcement be funded, maybe a greater share of that, or even all of that reinforcement, should that be funded by the DNO rather than the connecting user making any contribution in their connection charge to reinforcement? And that is certainly one of the options that we're actively looking at. That would obviously reduce the upfront connection charge for those, but as I say, that is maybe, if that was to go ahead, that's some years in the potentially 2023 or 2024. In the short term, I think I would always encourage users to speak to engage with the DNOs, see what types of connections are available. Is there a firm connection that's needed? Is there opportunities there for non-firm or flexible connections that perhaps avoid reinforcement and provide a solution that still meets the needs of the user? That's where I would say in the short term, any potential solution would lie. But engagement with the DNO is there, would be my sort of first port of
Yeah.
call.
We are engaging with the DNO, and to be fair to them, they are being quite amenable to discussions with us. So that's fantastic. The problem is for community energy groups is we are in a atmosphere of complete uncertainty from Ofgem in terms of the non-domestic RHI, and the timing is quite difficult now because obviously the non-domestic RHI is in danger of being stopped even before these new charging mechanisms come into place. It makes it very, very hard, this uncertain environment, for us to do our work, because let's face it, a lot of this decarbonization and net zero targets is about grassroots work that community energy does. That's what we do, and that's how going to play a major role in creating affordable, clean energy in the future. So, yeah, it would be nice if we had more of a certain environment, regulatory environment to work under. And I appreciate that you're just one person, and
No, but
I do appreciate everything.
no, that's
Yeah.
fine. What I can take from that, and just seeing some of the chat messages that are coming up in agreement with yourself, what I'm taking away is, regardless of the subject, whether it's in the RHI, whether it's charging or access, predictability is key, or predictability of income is key, and volatility, unnecessary volatility doesn't help, or uncertainty doesn't help anyone.
Thanks, Kyla and David. I wonder whether anybody else on the floor has any comments on how that kind of project could resolve its issues. Please just unmute and speak if you do. It's fine. It's quite a specialist area, so not everybody's going to be working on local heat networks.
Yeah, Duncan, it's James DeRink. I work with UK Power Networks. So yeah, it's interesting to hear Kayla's story. I think one of the suggestions is to all of the DNOs are building their investment plans for 2023 to 2028, and I think one part of that, certainly within UKPN, we've contacted every local authority with a view to trying to get their views on how their energy needs, the future energy scenarios at a distribution level will be built up. Certainly we've done that, and I'm aware that at least 2 or 3 other DNO groups, and I'd be surprised if none had done that, or if any hadn't done that. So certainly in terms of forward looking, I would encourage any community investment schemes to get in touch with the local authorities and make sure that their needs are captured by the local authority, and that will then feed into the DNO's plans. As David said, we're all aware that the charging arrangements will change for reinforcement, and the DNOs will bear more of that cost and will be funded for that cost in turn. So to best make benefit of that, it's important that those requirements, those developments are built into the local authorities' plans, and then DNOs will take that and submit a plan in line with those requirements.
Okay, are you assuming that all local authorities have future energy scenario plans? I know that the DNOs are involved in the DFES process, and that local area energy planning is something that the Energy Systems Catapult, and we have been working with them to get community energy sort of incorporated as a key partner from the outset. Because a lot of local authorities don't have that focus in our experience. And wondered whether you would be equally receptive to receiving sort of speculative visions and thoughts from community energy groups who are perceiving opportunities for projects, in the very early stages of conceptualization. Yeah, sure. So yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that we
we want input to our plans. The more input we can get, the better justified those plans become in our case to bid for the next price control period. So absolutely, and I think to go back on your first question, yeah, absolutely. I think the breadth of engagement, the breadth of technical expertise in planning the future energy requirements, or certainly electricity requirements in the local authorities, is mixed. Some are fairly on game, and some are less close to having a formal plan. I think that's fair to say.
And do you think local area energy planning is part of the solution? Obviously, it'll need probably central government investment to come up with sort of proper granular local area energy planning, which will save money in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, the better visibility everybody has of how the progression of the energy transition will happen, the more strategic we can be, and ultimately the lower cost we can be as not as a DNO, not as Ofgem, not as any individual party, but as a community. The lower overall cost society will bear. If we need to reinforce, and we will need to reinforce quite a lot of the network, because energy vectors electricity as an energy vector will increase. I don't think anyone's contesting that. So there will be a need to invest in the network. If we can do that once rather than piecemeal, it's clearly a better case, and that's why we as a DNO group, as a stakeholder in that, will want to do that once rather than several times.
And this is my question. What about partnering with interventions that are already digging up the road? For instance, the rollout of fibre broadband, which is in some cases taking new wires in new holes to every household. And it feels like a little bit of speculative copper in the ground at that point might enable a lot of distributed generation and flexibility for the future.
Indeed, yeah, and that all comes down to planning. So the better visibility we get about what's going to happen. If we put a cable in the road, it might not be needed for 4 or 5 years. If we can be confident it will be needed in 4 or 5 years, then we can justify and wash our face with that with Ofgem, and ultimately Ofgem will govern what we get allowances for and what we don't get allowances for. So the more certainty in the planning, the better for everybody.
Absolutely, yes. David, I noted in the Ofgem methodology consultation response, local area energy planning, which was part of the consultation, is sort of mentioned, and there is a working group on it. I also got an impression from not a very thorough reading that there's a slight tendency towards centralized planning for the energy transformation to DSO. Can you put me right on that, or give us some more information?
Maybe one I'd have to take away on that one, unfortunately. I wouldn't be able to comment now, but certainly I can follow up.
Okay, thank you. Just to give you a heads up, we're planning with the Energy Systems Catapult a round table with statutory stakeholders, government, networks, Ofgem, to look at local area energy planning and the role that community energy can be facilitated to play in it. Okay, moving on, unless there's anybody else got a comment on Kyla's issues, or anybody else has got a live or even possibly historic regulation challenge that they want to share. Please unmute and speak. Okay, I think we've. Oh, Saskia from the Low Carbon Hub. Would you like to share?
It was just a particular challenge that we're coming across is going to be about access to data. For example, who owns the data in a smart meter, and how you can get that fine-grained enough. So it's really asking a question in terms of how data ownership is going to be part of this review and access to that data.
So data, in itself is not something we're necessarily looking at within the access SCR, focusing more on charging access there. But we have set out our plan, as Ofgem, we've set out our plans around what we plan to do in data and availability and transparency of data within our forward work plan. So again, I'd sort of encourage people to look at that on our website, and then submit views. As I say, it's open, consultation and that is open till 19th of February, I think it was, so you'll be able to input into the process there.
Brilliant. Any last real world issues before we move back to the questions? No, brilliant. Okay, well, these are fairly real world. Local supply. Many community energy organizations want to carry out local supply projects, which are not feasible on a wider basis presently. Would any of the changes you're considering enable or go some way towards enabling local supply? And as a follow-on connected with that, what's Ofgem's view of the local electricity bill going through Parliament, seeking local electricity supply licenses? And do you support, and how could you facilitate?
So my understanding of the local energy bill as it currently stands is it's still going through the parliamentary process. So I think due to go through its second reading at some point, so it maybe get a bit early to give a definitive view on that. And from what I have seen, if it's quite short on detail. But my understanding is that if implemented, it gives local generators the opportunity to become local suppliers. But that any regulation and oversight of those new entities should be proportionate. And I think from an Ofgem perspective, we would likely oversee that licensing process like we do with other licenses today. But probably would need further thought about how we balance the sort of the encouragement or the ability for local suppliers to come to the fore while still balancing consumer protection and ensuring local suppliers are financially resilient. Within the charging and access work, the access SCR, we're not looking at supply, or we're not looking at supply licensing. Within that, it's more on the use and the charging for the use of distribution networks. So I'd suggest them maybe to slightly removed from each other.
Yeah, obviously, supply is low margin, complicated, and we've seen a number of smaller operators coming to grief on that reef recently. But obviously, community energy is likely to want to do quite intensely local, quite small scale supply projects, as is possible in Germany and Denmark and places. So we would be really delighted to see Ofgem engaging with regulating for that kind of quite intensely local energy system developments. A couple of questions around connection costs. Is it fair to be looking to develop projects based on connection costs, lowest connection costs, I presume, rather than versus carbon footprint or demand by consumers in communities? The comment is it's not their fault that their grid has been under invested and is in constraint. And one that occurs to me in relation to that is the energy system historically has been, or Ofgem's remit has been least cost, and that has historically facilitated connections by generators who can move around their technology to locate, to connect at places of lowest cost, and that includes peaking gas plants and diesel and so on. Well, community energy can't move its community just because it's cheaper to connect somewhere else. So, but yet it delivers resilience and legion community benefits, which do not have a sort of factor in their favor in the judgment about connection costs.
Yeah. Okay. No, a good two questions or several questions. I think. Sorry. I think the question is it right for people to factor in or to meet the cost of reinforcement and further investment in the network being needed? I think certainly historically that has been the approach that we've taken. We've tried to encourage people to locate where it places least cost in the system or has least further investment being needed. It's a very good challenge to then say, well, can people actually respond to that? Obviously you're not going to move a community or they're unable to move, but I think that also applies to other users as well. If we think about large demand users, maybe logistics companies, access to transport networks are maybe more important than access to the electricity network. So I think we are sort of considering the ability of people to respond to those signals, whether or not it's more effective or we get improved results from sending a signal through an enduring use of system charge rather than an upfront locational charge that they face at the start. So I think that is something that is a consideration that is definitely playing into our thoughts on the connection charging reform, especially.
Thank you. That's heartening to hear. I noticed more by chance than design in the methodology response that DNOs would like some kind of standard cost benefit analysis, including social benefit. Obviously, we would like to input into that. I didn't notice that there was going to be any consultation. Is there a way we can do that? Because we too are working on the difficult problem of being able to quantify the social benefit of community energy in a way that people can sort of factor it into investment decisions and decisions about prioritization of how to develop the energy system.
Well, certainly that sector-specific methodology decision that was published before Christmas had already been consulted on.
I know we fed in, but not on that particular cost-benefit analysis.
Maybe on that point, that's something I could put you in touch with the RIIO-ED2 team directly. I think that would be maybe the most straightforward approach there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the question about carbon benefits as well doesn't seem to be front and center. I know you mentioned it as a part of the efficient system development principle, but doesn't seem to be front and center. And often community energy projects are doing more for the energy system than just generating kilowatt hours off a roof. They are having multiple and diverse energy interventions, which are ultimately saving uncounted amounts of carbon. And we'd like that to be able to be factored in somehow. I know it's quite intangible.
No, I think in the time that, on that point, in the time that the SCR has been running, we've obviously had legislation for net zero. So maybe while it wasn't front and centre, that's when the SCR was launched. As Ofgem as a whole, we've published our decarbonisation action plan since then. We've published updated guidance on our impact assessments that will be used for the Access SCR, that take into account various decarbonisation pathways. So that I will apologise if that didn't come through in the slides, but it's certainly in our thinking, and will be factored into our decision making.
Thank you. Good. We'll continue pressing and working with you on that. Right, catching up with my notes, which are being beautifully curated for me. I'm going to just read it out because I haven't got time to mentally process it, I'm afraid. Where regulatory charges are some years in being developed, could you not put in place, say, a 5 or 10-year simple package to get projects flowing, clearly stated as not setting a precedent that is a barrier to more optimal outcomes later? Is that a transition arrangements question, or is it something more separate?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. They're obviously, with the price control periods, they are, well, we're moving from an 8-year to 5-year approach. I think in terms of charging arrangements, so the network charging arrangements, I need to think whether or not that person thinks the current arrangements change too often, or maybe don't change enough. And if a 5-year approach would be better or worse. But I think hearing the comments earlier about sort of predictability and consistency, I'm not sure if people. Yeah, I think I may be struggling with a bit more background on that question.
Yes, if whoever, I can't find in the notes who asked that question, if there's a qualifying, if you can make it a little clearer, that might be useful for David and everybody. And another question is, and are Ofgem, it's obviously following on, so this may clarify, and are Ofgem considering whether granularity that might work for generation charging, I presume, may or may not work for demand users in the energy market that we're likely to have in the immediate future?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we are looking at in the Dnos reforms is the extent of granularity that's possible. With the current arrangements and with the current data that we have on networks, but also whether or not that level of granularity is appropriate for all users as well. So if I take the extreme of the small domestic user, the household user, is it right that they face particularly granular charges that perhaps they have no ability to respond or no willingness to respond to, versus a much larger demand user or a larger generator who is much more engaged and able to respond? So I think there is consideration given to how appropriate the granularity of charging is for different types of user and at different levels of the network.
Right, and that is something that Ofgem is actively doing, yes?
Yes, so within the Access SCR, within charging, the Dnos charging work stream, we are looking at would we do something different for small users? What arguments are there too?
Okay. Sorry, I've lost a question that was in the chat. Yes, John Taylor asks, one of the big blockers stopping hyperlocal supply is the lack of real-time data monitoring on low voltage networks. The DNOs just have no visibility to enable immediate settlement and quantify the benefits of saved reinforcement. How are Ofgem encouraging this sort of investment? I suppose that is first digitalization and then platforms to enable that data to be visible.
Yeah, I'm probably not qualified myself to talk on the data side, but again, like I mentioned previously in Saskia's question, refer people to our forward work plan, where we set out our proposals around data and the work that we're planning to take forward. But yes, certainly the availability of data, especially at the lower voltage tiers, has been an issue. I think certainly within the excess SCR, the level of granularity that we think is possible in charging is limited by primarily the data that's available.
Yeah, and obviously the technology to collect that data as
yes.
well.
And
the sharing seems to be doable, but sometimes it's just not. It's a spinning disk rather than a piece of digital technology. Okay, we had some interesting questions pre-sent, which I would like to get to. And there are some very practical ones. Rosie Gillam from NG asks about delays to registering pre-registered solar PV sites. And they have 44 installs awaiting registration. The earliest from November 2019. And that's a big backlog of payments. How can this be facilitated? The impression is that the FITS team post FIT scheme has been tapered down, and just isn't the resource to process the final burst of FIT projects.
Yeah, so I had assumed it was on the environmental programs, or the FITs, because I wasn't entirely sure what registration was being referred to there. But while maybe can't comment, certainly I can't right now comment on specific cases, what would be useful if that person wants to get in touch with me or leave their contact details, I can certainly put them in touch with the relevant team if there is a specific case or cases that is causing a problem.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. And Andy Heald asks, if another organisation was put in charge of protecting vulnerable customers in the UK, how much of a pivot would this mean for Ofgem? And do you think that's a good idea? Or,
well, I'd maybe turn this question around and ask if the person thinks there's something that we're not doing that we should be doing, or could be doing better. I think what I would say is that our principal objective, Ofgem's principal objective, is about protecting existing and future customers, and that includes, but is not limited to, vulnerable customers. So in this hypothetical situation, if there was another organisation in place, we would still, I think, have a role to protect customers' interests. We do, on vulnerable customers specifically, we do already have taken to regard the interests of individuals who are disabled, chronically sick, pensionable age, financially vulnerable, or perhaps residing in more rural locations. I think we've also extended that even further. So yeah, I don't think our consumer protection responsibility or objectives would change, but I think it would depend on the situation and how we would work with any sort of organisation in the future.
thank you. I mean, I've noticed that there's a lot of very legitimate worry about system costs being borne by the people who don't have the ability to invest their way out of paying them. And I think it's hugely important, but it does seem to be the basis of the minister refusing to support the local electricity bill for fear of unintended consequences. Well, of course, we would never do anything if we were afraid of unintended consequences. And I feel we've got to move to protecting everybody, not just to focus on vulnerable consumers, and that actually, we must not use that as an excuse not to innovate and develop, which I'm sure you would agree with. In the final few minutes, there's a question about again, sort of local area energy planning. And Tom Broughton from Celesco says, in my experience, DNOs are organized only to respond to connection requests on a single site basis. Could the DSOs be given the responsibility to work with local authorities to develop their area-wide energy generation plans, local area energy planning?
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas that does cut across the Access SCR work and ED2 for that matter. One of the potential issues that we do think exist with the current arrangements is this incremental approach to network development, or connection by connection approach to development, and whether or not there is a more efficient approach that could be done, and if moving to a more shallow connection boundary requiring the DNO to fund the reinforcement that's required to facilitate new connections, whether or not that opens the door to taking a more holistic approach and encourage the DNOs to engage with local authorities and wider stakeholders on their plans. So I think.
Thank you. Is that something that Ofgem is actively considering? Because it's John Scott has just qualified his earlier question about which we found difficult to answer, about 5 or 10 year arrangements. Some arrangement where reinforcement costs that are a barrier to new community developments or connections could perhaps be for a short period shared in some case-by-case arrangement with the DNO and the user. Is that something that that Ofgem would, that ad hoc arrangement, something that Ofgem would support and facilitate?
I think it's difficult to say without knowing the detail of it, but we do have in place our innovation link, or a regulatory sandbox approach, where if there was one-off projects or trial projects that are slightly outside of the normal regulatory arrangements, like perhaps discounting or deferring charges in some way, if there was a proposal that came forward through that, we would certainly look at it, we'd consider it. We've done that with a number of sort of trial projects or test projects over recent years. So I don't think we would rule out.
So is it something that projects should initially contact their DNO about coming to some arrangement and then refer to Ofgem if there's sort of blanket refusal or problems?
Well, I think, yeah, I think the DNOs are a good first point of call. But yes, if there were maybe regulatory barriers, or it couldn't work within, for whatever reason, couldn't work within the current regulatory framework, then yes, we'd definitely be interested in knowing that, and that could lend itself to maybe a time-limited derogation, maybe a much wider policy change. I think that discussion would obviously be had at that time.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we're coming to our final moments. So I would like to thank everybody for coming, and a huge thank you to David for fronting up a large organization single-handedly and doing it brilliantly, and for his kind offers to take stuff back and feedback to us. I'd also say to everybody, if there are actions either for your organization, for Community Energy England, or for Ofgem that you have identified and that we might not pick up, please feed them in the relevant direction, and we will try and carry on moving this forward. Because we want to improve things for everybody. And ultimately, we would like to see the transformation of the energy system regulated to get to net zero, not by 2050, because that's too late, as fast as possible, and to maximize social benefit in doing so. Two of the great motivators of community energy. So I would like to, if John would put up the big question. No, that's not yet, is it? The big question we would like you all to ask, to answer in the chat. But meanwhile, John has a couple of polls, quick polls that he would like to put up. 20 seconds to answer each one. First one is up. And just to say, we hope you felt you learned something about Ofgem's work, and that you're motivated to engage with it in yours. We will try and draw out the learning and share it in note form on the website and in the newsletter and with Ofgem. And remember, you can feed back to Ofgem via FutureChargingandAccess at ofgem.gov.uk, and a reminder to have a look at the forward plan. So the webinar has been recorded and will end up on our YouTube channel, and a link will be sent out in a newsletter soon. And I'm sure David will take our points back to colleagues at Ofgem, and we will follow up with any action points you throw at our heads in due course. As things move on, we will look to organising another catch-up session to enable CEN members to input to Ofgem decision-making and keep abreast of the developments in their thinking. Finally, thank you all for attending, and we look forward to your feedback and to seeing you in the flesh very soon. I think the results of the polls are up. Is that? And John, could you put up the big question, and then we will leave the Zoom open for people to write their responses, and then we will save the chat. And I just say goodbye and mute myself.